I have Martin Durkin as my guest here today.
I'd like to talk about a new film I'm making about climate science, or lack of, and climate politics, if that's all right. I made a film many years ago, 16 years ago, The Great Global Warming Swindle, and I thought it was time to revisit the area. And actually, after the last podcast I did with you, I was in a happy position of being offered private funding from the US to make another film. And so I'm going to be making a feature-length doc on everything pertaining to climate politics. And for that, I've been plowing through your wonderful podcasts and listening to lots of things that people are going to say. I must say, you have done a lot of very excellent podcasts with a lot of great people, with a lot of good material coming through. And also there's much more out there than there was 16 years ago. But one thing we're hoping to do with the film is to look a little bit behind the politics of the nature of the way the scientific world works in this regard, and also some of the politics and other aspects behind it. And so I'm putting out the call for help, if you like.
I was just thinking so much stuff has happened since 2007, because that was before ClimateGate. Just that was a big deal. And then, so many other things. It was before Obama was president, before COVID. So a lot of changes, I'm sure, in this version of the film.
Yeah, an awful lot. And also, when I remember making a much earlier film called a series called Against Nature, where we looked at briefly the theory of global warming. And I remember at the time I was thinking, we won't do a big section on global warming because that'll blow over. It won't last. That was in, I think, 1997, thinking this surely can't last because it doesn't seem to make any sense. And then in being asked to make the film in 2007 and thinking, it's nice to get the film in now because this will pass. It'll be a passing phase. Sure enough, here we are 16 years later. And if anything, it's stronger. So it's more pervasive. I think back then it was a more narrowly green issue, environmentalist issue. And now it's this sort of great blobby monster that seems to have taken over so much thinking, especially in the West, that it's a different phenomenon. I think this will be a different kind of film, I think.
And you're already starting to reach out to some people that might be interviewed for the film now.
Yeah, we're talking to a lot of the folks we interviewed in the last film, and we'll be wanting to interview again, and others who have been working on various aspects of this. Obviously, the science is something we very much want to address and see what the state of the science is. And that in itself is enormously interesting. But I think as well as that, other stuff has come up that it would be great to get more input from other people. And for example, in the process of talking about the scientists also discuss the atmosphere in which they're working. And obviously, ClimateGate and so on, there's talk of manipulation of data, the failure of the models, and the misrepresenting of models as something much more definite and in accord with reality than they are, presenting speculation as fact, discrediting of dissenters. That's one thing that we want to look at, the way in which there's a bullying of scientists. And it ranges from formal to informal. The more formal stuff is scientists who doubt the global warming orthodoxy, failing to get grants, failing to get promotions, so on and so forth. Failing to get papers published because peer review is acting as a kind of form of censorship, effectively, these days. But also the sort of lower level bullying of just being ostracized and being regarded as beyond the pale for questioning global warming, that sort of thing as well. It gets really serious. I mean, I've just in the past week been speaking to scientists, one of whom, a very old, distinguished scientist, who said he'd had death threats to him, to his wife, to his children, and his grandchildren. And you think, what the heck? This is North America. What on earth is happening? I want to explore that a little bit. And that's not just about scientists themselves. That's in the broader world as well. You have people in businesses who are senior business people who are scared to speak out and say that they think this is nonsense because they will be bullied out of their jobs. You've got people, heads of car companies and senior people at banks who have literally been suspended or sacked or moved on because they've said they thought this was nonsense. It's unacceptable to think this is nonsense now. I think you tweeted yesterday, Elsa's tweet, one of the warmers tweets, saying this is actually, climate denial is actually borderline criminal now. They're actually talking about this as against the law. They aspire to make it against the law to even express an opinion against this. And that, I'd love to get some anecdotes and maybe some whistleblowers from inside various areas to talk about that level of intimidation.
Okay, you are looking then for tips from people, right? You'd like people to contact you with stories, anecdotes, etc.
Yeah, I think that would be really, I mean, some of them might make the film, and others I think would be useful for when the film comes out. What I'd also like to do is have a series of articles as well, exploring the issues raised in the film, because there's so much more material. Even now, there's more material than we've got that can fit into a 90-minute film. But we'd like to explore these in other ways. Obviously, it would be really good to have a special series of Tom Nilsson podcasts to go along with the film, interviewing some of the guys who are in the film about what they're talking about. But as I say, it would be really good to get people, not just scientists, folk in the media who have experienced the formal and less formal ways in which censorship of skepticism works, the way big broadcasters will simply not countenance anything skeptical, broadcasting the views of anyone skeptical. Likewise, within the realms of, in the field of environmental journalism, as environmental journalism generally we think of as a kind of objective, critical occupation where you're looking at a particular story with a critical eye and trying to find a story. But environmental journalism, they're part of the club. The very job of an environmental journalist really depends on global warming being true. If you haven't got a climate crisis, would newspapers really have environmental journalists just because we like trees and we enjoy tigers? Generally, you need that crisis in order to justify the job. So there's nothing objective really about environmental journalism. They are part of the propaganda machine, as it were. And anyone internal to that who's happy to talk about that. And also these days on social media, the more invisible forms of censorship on various social media platforms where they just decide, they shove in an algorithm that will say, let's downgrade a lot of the skepticism because we disapprove of it. So yes, anyone in the media who've got great stories or revelations, that would be great. Also in universities, in education, not just in universities, the amount of money, apart from the bullying of scientists, there's the amount of money that's going into climate research and the way in which that funding organization works. That's really interesting because that's a common thing. When talking to scientists, they often say there's so much money available for research pertaining to climate. Obviously you've got to be part of this because otherwise you won't get your funding. And if you say this is all nonsense, you don't qualify for that funding. So there's a literal kind of Pavlovian trigger, if you will. Buy into climate, get the money. Don't buy into climate, you're on the scrap heap, as it were. And then the ideology within universities, the fact that there have been lots of studies of American universities where they say, I think at Harvard or something, they found that 99.9% of professors were Democrat, for example. And Democrats are much more, twice as likely to believe in climate crisis, climate chaos, all this sort of thing, than Republicans. Because, as we know, it's a sort of proxy for your attitude towards free market capitalism. If you like free markets, then you'll tend to be skeptical. If you don't like free markets, then you'll tend to embrace the climate thing. And so that obviously is a sort of ideological cloud that exists within universities. And again, to step outside of that is very difficult if you're an academic, or less likely to be invited around to drinks parties and all that sort of thing. It can work on that really subtle level of intimidation and censorship as well. But also schools. We want to look at school textbooks, kids' schools, where this is obviously presented as a slam dunk. There is absolutely no skepticism in these textbooks. So the schools are little machines for creating these whole armies of Greta Thunbergs, sort of coming along that, very eagerly going out and demonstrating. And this is just a moral cause beyond question. And this is, in a sense, how they create a world in which denialism, if you're a denier, you really are beyond the pale, you are a demon. So the demonization of disagreeing with them on this, we'd like to hear about from people in that area. And also politics. I think one area that, if you talk informally off the record to a lot of politicians, they will often think this climate thing is obviously complete nonsense, but they couldn't possibly say that publicly because political strategists tell them, look, do the calculations here, you'll get absolutely slaughtered if you come out and you question climate science. And they'll say, how dare you, because you're not qualified to do this, and the scientific establishment says that. And so there is, on that level as well, sense in which the political calculation is such that very few politicians are willing to stick their head above the parapet and say, this isn't right. So again, people from inside that political world, it would be interesting to hear from. And as I say, and likewise, energy, actually, that's another strand of the story, is the way in which energy provision has been so skewed in the West because of this. There's been such an assault on big oil and gas and coal and a drive towards renewables, which the Greens are constantly saying makes great sense to have wind and solar and so on. And yet a cursory glance at the industry makes you think this is not working. Energy, the costs of energy are going sky high and so on. But it has become such a politically charged atmosphere within the energy industry. Again, we'd be keen to talk to people within that industry about the stuff that's going on there. It's really hard because there's so many stories here. There are so many areas which are very interesting to look at. As I say, only some will make the grade in terms of getting into the film, but I think we can still use a lot of the other anecdotes for spin-off stories and so on.
I just wanted to throw in this quote that you had from your last appearance on this podcast. Climate change, quote, is the banner under which anti-capitalism marches, end quote. I like that one a lot.
Yeah, no, it's come home to me and more and more over the years when talking to people who will have no idea about the science. They have literally not a clue, but they are so convinced anyway of the truth. But it was so clear to me that the degree to which they bought into the kind of climate nonsense was such a close reflection of their political views. And those people who really dislike capitalism in a certain way, actually, I say anti-capitalism, but actually you have different kinds of, historically, we've had different shades of anti-capitalism, as it were. The old one, in the days of old-fashioned socialism, we used to, because I used to be on the left way back in the day when I was young and extraordinarily stupid, there used to be this fantasy that socialism would outproduce capitalism, that the Soviet Union would have bigger, better factories, and they would produce more goods and better goods, and the workers would therefore be richer. And of course, that did not happen on a spectacular scale. And the new kind of anti-capitalism, although I think actually looking back, this has always been there, is a much more kind of snobby one, where the dislike for capitalism from a lot of the literati comes from the fact that it's been so successful. Capitalism is producing too much. There's this disgusting proliferation of goods. There's this vulgar consumer society that people are in. Everyone wants trainers and too many televisions and too many cars. And it's all a bit disgusting. And it's all a bit revolting that the masses are just gorging themselves on a kind of prosperity. There's a kind of horrible puritanical streak in the new anti-capitalism, but it's a puritanical streak that's directed to ordinary people, not to themselves. Modern anti-capitalists, they never think they themselves are consuming too much. It always seems to be the disgusting lower orders who are up to that business. One aspect of looking at this is the kind of anti-capitalism that's part of the package, as it were, of the climate crisis, of the climate nonsense.
I do think there's some pearl clutching among the elites that the poor folk, their TVs are too big and they're flying too much, and we got to do something about this.
Yeah. I think I mentioned it last time. I always find it ironic that if you go onto these marches, these anti-capitalist climate marches, the people are saying, the mass tourism is a terrible thing. It's destroying the planet. Gaia can't cope. It's destroying the trees and plants and animals, and we can't have all these people on the map. But they themselves, the upper middle class students who are spouting off this, have just been to South America while I'm touring around the place, and they've just been to the Arctic to look at the polar bears, and they've obviously been on a cultural tour of Europe. And generally, when they go abroad, it's travel, and it's rather highfalutin and worthwhile, and they're exploring the planet. But when the lower classes travel, that's mass tourism. They're not going to picture galleries. That's the problem with them. There's a real snobbery in this anti-capitalism. I think there always was, actually. It was a delusion that it was ever really a workers' movement.
There was just a case in the last few months, possibly, where someone on TV was interviewed and they were saying we should ban flights to Fiji because that's too wasteful. And then there was an additional line of questioning. They were asking, where did you fly most recently? And the answer was Fiji, the person who had just said we should ban flights to Fiji. Yeah.
And yeah, the hypocrisy is staggering. You have these people at Davos and these various sort of jamborees they have, and they're all flying in on private jets, and you have the Duke and Duchess of Sussex swanning about the place saying stuff, and Prince Charles, of course, now King Charles, has been grinding on about this for ages. He's got his Aston Martin and various other cars, and I think people can see that sort of rank hypocrisy, but they don't care. It carries on regardless. But I think that's why you don't have lots of working class. I still use the language of class. It's a terrible habit I got into in my Marxist days. You don't see working class people on these anti-capitalist rallies because they know it's directed at them. It's directed against them, all this stuff. Consume less, drive less, give up your car. Just have an incredibly expensive Tesla. You can't have a sort of a bashed up Ford because that's bad for the planet. Don't take far. They know that this is actually, they are the object of this kind of, this assault, that they're having to pay more for the heating. And it matters to them. If you're rich and you have to pay a bit more for your electricity and gas, it doesn't matter so much. If you're not well off, it really does matter. That does make a difference. Having to spend more on food because it's locally grown by hippies or whatever the damn thing is, that matters to you. And so and I think that people are not so stupid that they don't understand that.
Very good. I'm just going to throw in one more quote here that I loved from the last podcast. Quote from you: "You might wake up early on a Saturday morning desperately needing a plumber, but you will never wake up on a Saturday morning desperately needing a sociologist." End quote.
I think that was a gag, but it hits upon an important point, which is a lot of the intelligentsia in the West almost define themselves against commercial activity. If you go to university, the degrees with the real kudos for the intelligentsia are those which are furthest removed from any kind of commercial application. So if you do philosophy or classics or French literature, you're right up there but if you do hotel management or golf course management or anything actually that's got any bleeding or accountancy, there is not the same kudos there. But that leaves them, when they leave university, with a very difficult situation because having rejected the market, as it were, the market then rejects them because what do you know? There is not a great call for people with degrees in French literature. And this is why a lot of state-funded activity, a lot of the public sector, as it were, the direct or indirect public sector, the NGOs and all this sort of thing, are jobs that those guys go into. And those are jobs vaguely related to the planning system, directly or indirectly, regulation, and also paid for out of taxation, directly or indirectly, an awful lot of the time. And so they tend to be in favor of planning and regulation, and they tend to be in favor of taxation. And it's these people who really, they always love problems. The thing about the public sector and the quasi-public sector, the third sector, is that they're there to solve problems. And so they need problems. They need obesity crises, and they need health crises, and they need threats from which they're going to protect us. And climate is a fantastic thing for them because, this is a terrible threat, which obviously calls for more research and some statistical work and some reports to be written and some legislation to be drawn up and then redrafted and then reworked and more conferences and more and so on and so forth. They're like pigs in shit. This is just absolutely perfect for them. And this is why I think climate really, you will far more find, if you look at university graduates, climate being an issue in the minds of someone who's doing French literature or classics or English literature or one of these things, than if you go to a guy who's doing mechanical engineering, who is far less likely to be found on one of those marches. There is a real divide there. At the moment, I need to pin this down a bit further, the film, because the film's going to have to be nice and snappy and absolutely on the money. But certainly I want to explore that a little bit because that's the real kind of, as it were, sociological basis of the climate bandwagon.
You think you might have time in the film to cover stuff like the possible seizing of private property for solar farms, or talking about the whole situation in the Netherlands, seizing farms for some sort of ridiculous nitrous oxide reason?
Yeah, I hope so. The thing is, there is so much. This is such a huge story, as you know, because you've done so many podcasts about this, and there are so many aspects to it. But certainly what I'd like to look at are the costs of the climate hysteria, both economic costs, because I think that now, insofar as the West is having an influence on energy policies, for example, in Africa and elsewhere, it's doing incredible harm because it's holding back African development enormously by discouraging them from using the oil that they have in great abundance and the coal that they have in great abundance. That they're doing horrible damage there, as indeed they're doing by trying to stop them using GM technology and other things. It doesn't stop at climate. But now, in the first world, the damage done to the manufacturing industry and also services, the economy as a whole, by driving up the cost of energy and also the proliferation of regulation, which has been extraordinary as a result of climate stuff. The costs are many and direct and indirect. And so we want to explore really what the damage being done to the livelihoods of ordinary people. That is something we really want to, because people are paying a price that they don't realize for this nonsense. So the economic costs, but also the social costs, the fact that in the narrative behind the climate hysteria is always against individual freedom. It's that we need to be constrained and limited, and our activities need to be channeled, and this needs to be monitored, and we need to behave. And this, behavioral, how to make people behave in certain ways is a big theme of discussion on the climate side, on the warmist side. And that links in a little bit to lockdown. You usually find people who are terribly upset about the climate. We're also very pro-lockdown. The notion of directing our lives down to the smallest degree is something that seems to be a big motivating force in that. So we want to explore that as well. But have all that bleakness and all that misery, as you say, there is light at the end of the tunnel, because ordinary farmers in Scandinavia and truck drivers in Canada and various others are starting to buck against this and say, this is beyond, we won't accept this anymore. And recently there was a great survey of how many people actually believe this nonsense. And given the onslaught of propaganda of global warming, it is incredible and encouraging that so few people actually believe it. Despite the fact that they dominate the schools, despite the fact that they write the textbooks for their school children, despite the fact that they completely dominate the universities, despite the fact that the whole scientific establishment is geared up to this, despite the fact that no large media output will criticize them in any way, shape, or form, people still don't believe it. And that is we should be very encouraged by that, I think.
So you actively would like to be contacted by people like, say, a businessman who gets driven out of a country because energy costs are too high, something like that?
And people in different, professions whose professional bodies are saying you have to sign up to this climate pledge or else you can't be a member of this professional body. Things like that. There's all sorts of factors, all sorts of areas of this kind of bullying and intimidation and the imposition of this dogma. So I'd love to hear from, if anyone thinks they've got a story or in fact want to do a bit of whistleblowing on how these climate fund organizations operate. Anything like that, we're very keen to hear. We have an email address, which I can give anyone who wants to get things off their chest. We're happy to hear from them. And that's climatemovieinfo@gmail.com. So that's one word, climatemovieinfo, as in information, @gmail.com.
So everything should be funneled to that address rather than trying to contact you on Twitter, or I guess they could put comments on this video as another possible way to do that, or what do you think?
Yeah, they could do that. At the moment, we're trying to get our infrastructure together for making of the film, and we need to get a proper sort of non-Gmail address and all that sort of thing. But in the meantime, that's the one we're using to try and gather, and again, whistleblowers, please blow your whistle here.
Yeah, especially you'd like if they have something on paper, right, that specifies that you have to buy into the climate.
Very much. I'd like to see the flowering of lots of ClimateGates. Where are the damning emails where it's quite clear that a lot of the scientists here know that the stuff that they're saying isn't true, or that it's a half-truth, or that it's a stretched truth? That would be really good, because that was a few leaked emails. ClimateGate, more leaked emails. That's what we want. We want to find out how this world works on the inside, because you and I both know that when you're talking to scientists, oftentimes off the record, you hear the most extraordinary things. I think we've got to expose really the internal workings, the cynicism behind a lot of the stuff that goes on. You know that if you can explain to a journalist, look, there is no increase in hurricane activity for over the past century, say, but still, they will come out with these, Donald Trump has just caused this latest hurricane story, all that sort of nonsense. They know, many of them know this is nonsense, but they still carry on. We need to expose that.
I think quite a bit of this stuff is right already on Twitter publicly, where people are saying completely crazy stuff. It's not even hidden in a private email. So that's another thing. Maybe we can send you the worst examples of that.
Yeah, no, there is. The thing that you tweeted yesterday, there's quite a lot of that going on, where you have these rabid climate activists who they'd have us hanged It is extraordinary, the stuff that's out there. Not all of it can make the film. We're eager for all the anecdotes we can get.
Yeah, and you were saying stuff that doesn't make the film might to get out in some other format, right?
I think so. I think when the film goes out, it'd be nice to get various articles published on different aspects of this in different places. Because there's a fight on. As far as I'm concerned, this is not just making a film, it's fighting back. Because so much hangs on this. The prosperity and freedom of... This is the story of the age, as I'm sure you'd agree.
I agree, absolutely.
And at the moment, we're not fighting back hard enough or coherently enough. I don't know. Anyway, they're winning at the moment, and we've got to stop that.
I may have asked you this before, but do you think there's something else queued up after this, after the climate scam is killed off?
I've no doubt they will. It is this is a major social class we're talking about. The people who are, and it is the establishment. They'll come up with something else. But having said that, I think if we can get rid of the climate thing, with each successive one, I think it gets harder for them. The cynicism that people had as a result of all the lockdown nonsense and the COVID nonsense, I think the cynicism that's creeping and growing about climate, every time one of these things happen, it becomes harder for them to wheel out the scientific establishment and say, we think you've got to just do what we say. I think that's becoming increasingly hard for them to pull off. More and more people are thinking, you've been proved wrong time and time again. Why should we just roll over and do exactly what you say?
Do you have more points you'd like to make?
No, just as I say, we're in pre-production now. We'll hopefully start filming in a few weeks. Filming might take some time because we've got to film in a few different places and talk to various different people. But the adventure of making the film starts here. And thank you very much for the podcast that kicked this off, because I didn't think I'd be that frivolously saying it would be great to make another film. And what do you know, now I'm making one.
This makes me super happy. And this could happen in maybe less than a year. I don't want to pin you down at all to any timeline, but it's not like it's years long. The project doesn't take years.
No, we're going to try and get this out in, I don't know, 6 months or so should be enough to get this done and dusted. We're going as fast as we can because I think it's important to get it out. And when it goes out, we want to make as much noise as we can. So what would be lovely is to have simultaneous premiere screenings in venues across America, and the UK and Australia and anywhere else we can, so that I want this to be a good old hand grenade that we're throwing. And the bigger the bang, the better. So again, when we're getting to the stage of launching the film, it'd be lovely to keep in touch, in short, and to use the network of people and sympathizers that we have and you have much more than me, to give the film a bit of a springboard. And hopefully the film will be a talking point and it can rally people in certain ways.
Still any chance to get it on Channel 4 where the original one was, or probably?
I'll certainly be approaching broadcasters with it. It is very hard. Part of the story is precisely how hard it is getting this kind of material on mainstream channels, but we'll certainly be trying. But also, I think we're going to look at theatrical release. How do we get it into cinemas? There are independent cinemas that might take this. So there are different strategies we can have for getting the film out there, but obviously we want maximum exposure.
Any other points for today?
No, just to thank you again for having me on.
Okay, thanks for being on. I'm excited to get this up online, and we'll see what comes through that Gmail address, what tips come in.
Brilliant. No doubt we'll be flooded with abuse.
All right, thanks a lot. We'll talk to you next time. Martin Durkin.
Cheers, Tom.
Goodbye.
Thank you very much.